Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is preside, and this verb was recommended by the viewer Hassan Mohammed. Thank you so much for your suggestion. Now let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we can use the verb preside. The first way you might encounter this verb means to be in the position of authority during a meeting or some other gathering. Okay. Sometimes we will see examples of this verb being used to describe the person who's sort of leading and directing a particular and more formal meeting. So you might think of things like board meetings, city council meetings, other gatherings a bit similar to that. A second way you might encounter preside means to be in charge of a particular place or situation. As I looked for examples of this verb being used, it was very common to see it used in connection to courts, and specifically talking about judges or justices being in charge of that particular place and situation. Situation meaning hearings or trials, various oral arguments, etc. So for now, you should know that preside is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of our verb, we're going to drop the E on the end because we have a vowel consonant E pattern. We're going to add our ing, and that forms presiding. The past tense and the participle form of our verb could be made by just adding the letter D, since this verb already ends in an E. Now that's the spelling, but the sound of our verb preside, ends in a D sound. And this means when I add that ed ending, I'm going to make an id sound, and I'm going to add an extra syllable as I say it. The past tense and the participle form of our verb should sound like this: presided, presided. Okay. Now let's take a moment and look at a few examples of phrasal verbs. You might encounter to preside at, meaning to exercise authority or control at some meeting, ceremony, or other event. An example of that in a sentence might be, who will preside at the next board meeting while you are away? Right? So maybe the leader is going to be away for other purposes, other reasons, and now we're curious, right? Who's going to have that authority and control to conduct the meeting? A second phrasal verb you might encounter is to preside over. It means to supervise and have authority over someone or something, controlling how that something or someone operates. An example of this: the vice president is presiding over the business while the president is out on medical leave. Right? So this is who is in control of the organization's decisions and operation at this time. Now, let's take a moment to review a couple verb tenses as we look at some more examples. Today, we're going to review the past progressive and the simple past tense. We'll start with the past progressive. This is frequently called the past continuous by many grammar books and grammar teachers, and that is perfectly fine. Past progressive and past continuous mean exactly the same thing. With this verb tense, we're talking about an action that was ongoing during a completed time period. And the reason I say past progressive with my students is I try and help them remember 2 P's to the verb tense mean I need 2 parts to make my verb. We'll be looking at that in just a moment. As we use this verb tense again, we're generally going to be focused on an action that was continuing, it was ongoing. And many times with the past progressive, we'll actually see 2 verbs being used in 2 clauses to the sentence. So in one verb tense, it's likely to see this ongoing or continuing action. And then in the second one, you might see the simple past tense used. And that is generally thought of being some interrupting type action, right? So this first thing is continuing, it's going on, and something else interrupts it. So maybe something a little more practical there as you're reading and paying attention to different verb tenses. But now let's talk about how we make past progressive sentences. This is going to be a verb tense where we need to pay attention to our subject. And that's because the first part of our verb will be using the past form of be. And there are two forms of be in the past tense. If your subject is I, he, she, or it, use was and then our ing form of the verb. But if the subject is you, we, or they, use were, W-E-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's look at our first affirmative example. The judge was presiding in the civil case when the defendant began ghostwriting social media posts that made false accusations against the judge. So it was actually kind of based on a true story. I tried to simplify, right? So this thing is ongoing, and this person is engaged in some very stupid behavior. So the judge is in control of this particular trial, and the defendant in the case is bad mouthing the judge on Facebook, I believe. Now let's take a look at a negative past progressive sentence. To do this, again, we're going to start with our subject. We'll use either was or were, whichever form matches our subject. Then we'll use not, and then our ing form the verb. Here's another example. The judges weren't presiding in trials last week. So maybe they were at conferences, having other meetings, or maybe they were on vacation, right? But they were not in charge of that particular situation. Now let's take a look at making a yes or no question in the past progressive. To do this, you want to start with either was or were, whichever form matches your subject, that subject comes next. Then use the ing form the verb. Here's another example. Were you presiding over the meeting when the shouting started? Okay, so maybe there's some kind of heated moment at a particular formal meeting, right? I kind of want to know, like, who was controlling the situation. Now, let's move on and make some sentences in the simple past tense. When we use this verb tense, our focus is noting that a particular action was completed at a known point in the past. Many simple past tense sentences are going to have time signals. They might note specific dates or times indicating that past, or indicating the completion of that activity when it occurred. But not every sentence will include that, and that's just okay. It can be implied as part of a longer passage or as part of a conversation. The nice thing about making sentences in the simple past tense is that your structure is going to stay the same no matter what your subject is. So in the affirmative, we're going to start with our subject, and then we're going to use that ed form of our verb because it's a regular verb. An example of this might be, the vice president presided over the electoral vote certification last December. Okay, this is a very formal meeting in the United States, right? And again, it's kind of describing who was in charge in conducting this particular event. Now, if you want to make a negative simple past tense sentence, what you should do is start with your subject, use did not, and then the base verb. So notice we're not using the ed form of our verb here. Let's look at another example. Biden didn't preside over the worst inflation in U.S. history. Okay? This would go back to that second definition, talking about being sort of in control of or in charge of something. In this particular sentence, it was something that got quoted a lot during our last election in the United States. It has been a challenging economic period over the last few years. However, this was not the worst inflation in U.S. history. I believe that occurred in the late 70s and early 1980s. So he was not in charge of that most serious or significant piece of inflation. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple past tense. To do that, we'll start with did, we'll have our subject, and then we'll have our base verb. Again, I always like pointing out to students, the only time I'm using that ed form of the verb is in the affirmative. Here's my last example. Did he preside at the organ? So this one's a little bit different. Sometimes you might encounter it as people talk about playing or performing music, kind of like the featured performer, one might say. Some might say they're kind of controlling or directing the entire performance with their particular role. Now let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb preside. And I'm not sure if you've ever thought about this, but the noun president comes from this same word family. So we might think of, yes, the president is the elected head of a republic, so a person kind of controlling and directing a particular country. So an example of this, the president has a 4-year term of office. Okay. If we were to use this word as part of someone's title, we might see it capitalized then. Here, this is more general, and that's why it has not been capitalized there. Now, a second and sort of related way we use the noun president is to refer to the head of a society, a council, a university, a company, or some other kind of organization. An example of this, the college is searching for its next president. Okay, so again, you might think leader, just like some of our earlier definitions of the verb as we were describing kind of the directing or leading that occurs with that verb. Another related, sorry, this should be an adjective, not a phrase. The adjective presidential generally describes someone having a demeanor that befits a president. So another way to think of that is sort of acting in a dignified way or a confident way. So an example of how we hear this used quite frequently right now in the United States is that presidential behavior, right? Referring to someone whose behavior may not seem so dignified or typical of a leader of a republic. Another noun you might encounter is the noun presidency, so referring to the period of a president's office. So what will his presidency be remembered for? It's a question many historians ask over time, kind of wanting to reflect on maybe accomplishments or disappointments, bad decisions, good decisions, all of that together is frequently debated and remarked on. Again, I want to say a special thanks to Hassan Mohammed for suggesting today's verb, and I thank you all for watching. Have a great day.